Hello friends, welcome back to Luthuf's Literary Club. In my last video, I discussed the end of the 18th century, particularly the age of Johnson. In this video, I'll discuss the Romantic period. The Romantic period is the most fruitful period in the history of English literature. The revolt against the classical school, which had been started by writers like Chatterton, Collins, Gray, Burne, Cowper, reached its climax during this period, and some of the greatest and most popular English poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats belong to this period. This period starts from 1798 with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and the famous preface which Wordsworth wrote as a manifesto of the new form of poetry which he and Coleridge introduced in opposition to the poetry of the classical school. In the preface of the first edition, Wordsworth did not touch upon any other characteristic of Romantic poetry except the simplicity and naturalness of its diction. The majority of the following poems he writes are to be considered as experiments. They were written chiefly with a view to ascertaining how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of school is adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. In the longer preface to the second edition of the Lyrical Ballads, where Wordsworth explains his theories of poetic imagination, he again returns to the problem of the proper language of poetry. Wordsworth chose the language of the common people as the vehicle of his poetry because it is the most sincere expression of the deepest and rarest passions and feelings. This was the first point of attack of the artificial and formal style of classical school of poetry. The other point at which Wordsworth attacked the old school was its insistence on the town and the artificial way of life which prevailed there. He wanted the poet to breathe fresh air of the hills and beautiful natural scenes and become interested in rural life and the simple folk living in the lap of nature. By attacking the supremacy of the heroic couplet as the only form of writing poetry, and substituting it by simple and natural diction, by diverting the attention of the poet from the artificial town life to the life in the woods, mountains, and village inhabited by simple folk, and by asserting the inevitable role of imagination and emotions in poetry as against dry intellectualism which was the chief characteristic of the preceding age. Wordsworth not only emancipated the poet from the tyranny of literary rules and conventions which circumscribed this freedom of expression, but he also opened up before him vast regions of experience which in the 18th century had been closed to him. His revolt against the classical school was in keeping with the political and social revolutions of the time, as the French Revolution and American War of Independence, which broke away with the tyranny of social and political domination, and which proclaimed the liberty of the individual or nation to be the master of its own destiny. Just as liberty of the individual was the watchword of the French Revolution, liberty of a nation from foreign domination was the watchword of the American War of Independence. In the same manner, liberty of the poet from the tyranny of the literary rules and conventions was the watchword of the new literary movement which we call by the name of Romantic movement. It is also termed as the Romantic Revival because all these characteristics, the liberty of the writer to choose the theme and form of his literary production, the importance given to imagination and human emotions, and a broad and Catholic outlook on life in all its manifestations in town, villages, mountains, rivers, etc., belong to the literature of the Elizabethan age, which can be called as the first Romantic age in English literature. But there was a difference between the Elizabethan age and the Romantic age, because in the latter the Romantic spirit was considered as discovery of something which once was but had been lost. The poets of the Romantic periods therefore always looked back to the Elizabethan masters, Shakespeare, Spenser, and others, and got inspiration from them. In the poems which were contributed in the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth dealt with events of everyday life by preference in its humblest form. He tried to prove that the commonplace things of life, the simple and insignificant aspects of nature, if treated in the right manner, could be as interesting and absorbing as the grand and imposing aspects of life and nature. To the share of Coleridge fell such subjects as were supernatural, which he was to inform with that semblance of truth sufficient to procure for those shadows of imagination that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment which constitutes poetic faith. Wordsworth's naturalism and Coleridge's supernaturalism thus became the two important spearheads of the Romantic movement. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and Scott belonged to the first Romantic generation, though they were in their youth filled with great enthusiasm by the outburst of the French Revolution, which held high hope for mankind. They became conservatives and gave up their juvenile ideas when the French Republic converted itself into a military empire, resulting in Napoleonic wars against England and other European countries. The revolutionary order therefore faded away, and these poets, instead of championing the cause of the oppressed section of mankind, turned to mysticism, the glory of the past, love of natural phenomena, and the noble simplicity of the peasant race attached to the soil and still sticking to traditional virtues and values. Thus, these poets of the first Romantic generation were not in conflict with the society of which they were a part. They sang about the feelings and emotions which were shared by a majority of their countrymen. The second generation of Romantic writers, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Leigh Hunt, Hazlitt, and others, who came to the forefront after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1850, revolted from the reactionary spirit which was prevailing at the time in England against the ideals of the French Revolution. The result was that the second generation came in conflict with the social environment with which their predecessors were in moral harmony. Moreover, the victorious struggle with the French Empire had left England impoverished, and the political and social agitations which had subsided on account of foreign danger again raised their head. The result was that there was a lot of turmoil and perturbation among the rank and file, which was being suppressed by those who were in power. In such an atmosphere, the younger Romantic generation renewed the revolutionary order and attacked the established social order. Thus, Romanticism in the second stage became a literature of social conflict. Both Byron and Shelley rebelled against society and had to leave England. The prose writers of the Romantic Revival also broke with their immediate predecessors and discarded the shorter and lighter style of the 18th century. They reverted to the ponderous, flowery, and poetical prose of the Renaissance and of Sir Thomas Browne, as we find in the works of Lamb and De Quincey. Much of the prose of the Romantic period was devoted to the critical study of literature, its theory and practice. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Lamb, Hazlitt, Leigh Hunt, and De Quincey opened up new avenues in the study of literature and gradually prepared the way for the understanding of the new type of literature which was being produced. As the Romantic age was characterized by excess of emotions, it produced a new type of novel which seems rather hysterical now, but which was immensely popular among the multitude of readers, whose nerves were somewhat excited, and who revelled in extravagant stories of supernatural terror. Mrs. Anne Radcliffe was one of the most successful writers of the school of exaggerated romances. Sir Walter Scott regaled the readers by his historical romances. Jane Austen, however, represents a marked contrast to these extravagant stories by her enduring work, in which we find charming descriptions of everyday life as in the poetry of Wordsworth. Whereas the classical age was the age of prose, the romantic age was the age of poetry, which was the proper medium for the expression of emotions and imaginative sensibility of the artist. The mind of the artist came in contact with the sensuousness and the world of thought at countless points. As it had become more alert and alive, the human spirit began to derive new richness from outward objects and philosophical ideals. The poets began to draw inspiration from several sources: mountains and lakes, the dignity of the peasant, the terror of the supernatural, medieval chivalry and literature, the arts and mythology of Greece, the prophecy of the Golden Age. All these produced a sense of wonder which had to be properly conveyed in literary form. That is why some critics call the Romantic Revival as the Renaissance of wonder. Summing up this short introduction to the Romantic Age or the Renaissance of wonder, the chief characteristics of Romanticism as opposed to Classicism, we can say that Classicism laid stress upon the impersonal aspects of the life of the mind. The new literature, on the other hand, openly shifts the center of art, bringing it back towards what is most proper and particular in each individual. It is the product of the fusion of true faculties of the artist, his sensibility and imagination. The romantic spirit can be defined as an accentuated predominance of emotional life, and romantic literature was fed by intense emotion coupled with the intense desire to display that emotion through appropriate imagery. Thus, romantic literature is a genuinely creative literature calling into play the highest creative faculty of man. So, this was a short introduction to the Romantic Age. In my next video, I shall discuss the Romantic poetry and the important poets in detail. Till that, stay connected to Lutuf's Literary Club. Happy learning, and don't forget to subscribe my channel if you have not subscribed so far. Thank you very much.